This is a video about a board game. But it's also a video about one of the most ingenious pieces of political propaganda ever created. The story I'm going to share with you over the next 30 or so minutes begins with one woman's anger at greedy landlords in the 19th century and ends with Big Macs. It even takes in an outrageous case of intellectual property fraud along the way. So, choose your pieces, count your money, and prepare to witness the birth of a monopoly. Hello friends! If you're watching this video shortly after its release, then it is very nearly Christmas. It's also almost Hanukkah and Kwanzaa and winter solstice. Or if you're watching this video at any other time of the year, then Happy July, I guess. My ears are ringing. Whether you observe any of these religious holidays or not, it's likely that at some point over the coming weeks, you'll be spending some time in the loving and maybe occasionally slightly irritating company of family and friends. And when you do, there's a reasonable chance that you might find yourself playing Monopoly. Or Paris Monopoly, or Friends Monopoly, or Arsenal Football Club Monopoly, or... No, that is as far as the budget would stretch. Please consider joining the Patreon. If you do find yourself playing a game of Monopoly, two things are certain. One, that you'll completely ignore the official instructions in favour of a proprietary set of house rules unique to you and your bloodline. And two, that before the game is through, there will be at least one threat of physical violence. See, Monopoly is something of a contradiction. On the one hand, it is perhaps the most popular commercial board game in the world, having sold over 250 million copies. On the other hand, the thing that most people associate the game with is anger and frustration. We've all got a story of someone we know going absolutely ballistic after landing on a space with a hotel and being forced to mortgage off their entire property portfolio. In fact, if you see a character produce a Monopoly board during a film or TV show, then it's like Chekhov's gun. You know it's getting flipped before the credits roll. This association isn't arbitrary. Because as a board game, Monopoly kinda sucks. There's a reason that it has an average rating of just 4.4 out of 10 on Board Game Geek. There's just very little ongoing tension to it. See, Monopoly works in such a way that the more properties you own and houses you build, the easier it becomes to get the money with which to buy more properties and build more houses. In fact, it's often fairly clear who is going to win after only the first few trips around the board. By the time one player has begun to put down houses, it takes some very good luck to catch up. Most players are thus forced to spend the majority of the playtime simply watching their cash stocks dwindle lower and lower until they inevitably go bankrupt. Lots of people try to fix this problem with various house rules. One such house rule dictates that any fines or taxes are collected into a pot, which is then given as a prize to anyone who lands on free parking. This is what game designers call a catch-up mechanism. Like the blue shell in Mario Kart, catch-up mechanisms aim to give some hope to players who are falling behind in a game by placing the current winner's lead under constant threat. But what if I was to tell you that the lack of such a catch-up mechanism in the official Monopoly rulebook isn't a mistake? That the anger which some people feel at the mere sight of rich Uncle Pennybags here is intentional? That the whole point of the board game Monopoly is to make you hate the board game Monopoly. See, in its modern form, Monopoly is often thought of as a celebration of capitalism. When reproduced on scratch cards or on fruit machines or on the side of a large fries, the iconography of the game seems to scream opportunity, even if we know that, for most players, the game itself usually ends in disaster. But as we're about to explore, this pro-capitalist mythology is in fact the product of a devious retcon, built on the back of perhaps the most audacious case of intellectual property fraud in modern history. Let me take you back to the year 1902 and introduce you to this very remarkable woman. This is Lizzie Magie. Born in Illinois in 1866, Lizzie Magie was, to put it lightly, a bit of a character. She was many things throughout her life. A poet, an actor, an engineer, a journalist, and, most notably, a board game designer. Maggie's real passion, however, was economics. In particular, she dedicated her life to building support for the political and economic ideas of this man, Henry George. Now, I'm going to take a guess that 95% of people watching this video have never heard of Henry George. It will perhaps surprise you to learn then that a good portion of the remaining 5% are absolutely obsessed. In fact, there's a whole genre of internet reply guide that responds to any vaguely economics-themed piece of writing or video with, read Henry George, please. But let me catch the rest of you up with a brief primer on the slightly weird economics of Henry George. So, Henry George was a journalist who found himself living in San Francisco during the economic boom of the 1870s. This was the start of the Second Industrial Revolution, and America was experiencing an unprecedented level of economic growth. What George noticed, however, was that the benefits of that growth were only being felt by a very small group of people. God, that just keeps happening, doesn't it? In fact, to George, it seemed as though the bank accounts of chaps such as Andrew Carnegie, J.D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan were swelling at much the same rate as the living conditions of most normal people were falling through the floor. Across the United States, George observed that where the population is densest, wealth greatest, and the machinery of production and exchange most highly developed, we find the deepest poverty, the sharpest struggle for existence, and the most enforced idleness. In September 1877, George thus sat himself down and began to write a treatise on political economy, which is simply what self-assured white dudes of a certain social status were forced to do in the 18th and 19th centuries, given that no one had gotten around to inventing podcasts yet. In his focus on inequality, George was in fact asking very similar questions to those which Karl Marx had been trying to answer whilst writing Capital a decade or so earlier. See, for all the reverence or horror that is attributed to it, Karl Marx's analysis for why capitalism breeds inequality is pretty simple. Marx observed that capitalist economies are characterised by a conflict between capitalists, that's business owners, and workers, that's anyone who works for a business in return for a salary or wage. He then pointed out that when deciding how much to pay their workers, business owners will always try to ensure that the economic value a worker creates for their business is greater than the wages the business pays them. To put it in Christmassy terms, Michael Caine is rich because he refuses to pay Kermit the Frog the full value of his labour, and no amount of third act turkey is going to change that. Henry George saw things a little bit differently. George saw the relationship between business owners and workers as one of good, honest collaboration. In a factory, for example, George would argue that the business owner provides the machinery, whilst the workers bring their labour, and both deserve to be rewarded for their contribution to producing hats, or chairs, or Funko Pops, or whatever it is this factory makes. Unfortunately, there is often another partner in this collaboration: the landlord. In many cases, before paying their workers or taking a profit for themselves, a business has to pay rents to the owner of the land on which their factory stands. A bit like, say, how you have to pay rent if you land on a square that someone else owns in Monopoly. And this got George pretty riled up, because he argued that the landlord didn't really bring much to the table. The business owner had bought all the machinery, the workers had put in a hard day's graft, The landlord, on the other hand, felt entitled to a piece of the pie simply because they happened to have the right piece of paper stuffed into a drawer somewhere. It was the need to pay idle landlords, George argued, which meant that capitalists simply couldn't afford to pay their workers more. This may all sound like someone making bad excuses for predatory employment practices. And yeah, it kinda is. But there were more radical aspects to George's politics. His hatred of landlords, for example, wasn't just practical, but moral. He thought it was ridiculous that anyone could claim to own a piece of nature. In an ideal world, he believed that all land and natural resources would be collectively owned by humanity in common. At the same time, he was a pragmatist. Rather than calling for any kind of widespread nationalisation of land then, George advocated for the introduction of what's called a land value tax. To put it simply, a land value tax is a tax on the rent that a landowner receives from their tenants. The twist is that the tax is calculated based solely on the value of the land itself, without regard to any buildings the owner might have constructed on top of it. The idea here is that if a landowner wants to do some actual work by building a house or factory or paintball arena, they deserve to keep any money that they make from doing so. But they shouldn't be able to get rich solely by owning the land itself. George was pretty optimistic about how lucrative this tax might be. He argued that if the US government were to introduce a land value tax, it would raise enough money that it could abolish all other taxes entirely. This would, in theory, alleviate poverty through allowing workers to keep the portion of their wages that they had previously been losing to income tax, sales tax, etc. Okay, but how does this relate to the board game Monopoly again? Well, in 1880, Henry George compiled these ideas into a book called Progress and Poverty. And it took the reading public by storm. Translations were published across the globe, and in America, the ideas contained within it began to inspire a political movement. Owing to the belief that a land value tax could replace all other taxes, the movement was known as the Single Tax Movement. And one of its most enthusiastic members was a young woman called Lizzie Maggie. But before we go any further, I want to say a big thank you to today's video sponsor, Morning Brew. Over the past year or so, I've been trying to cut down on the amount of time that I spend aimlessly scrolling through social media. I've been particularly keen to wean myself off my Twitter habit for various, quite guessable reasons. There's just one problem. Over the past half-decade or so, Twitter and social media more generally have been where I get the bulk of my news. Luckily, a little while back, I discovered Morning Brew. Morning Brew is a free daily newsletter that provides a succinct and fun summary of each day's headlines. It aims to get you up to speed with everything that's going on in the worlds of politics, business, and tech in just 5 minutes. And like I've said, it's fun. The writers at Morning Brew seem to really understand that sometimes a witty little joke is exactly what's needed to make the important parts of a story stick in the brain. One thing that Morning Brew has really helped me to do is to keep much better tabs on the stock market and business news. I've not traditionally been someone who pays too much attention to what the S&P 500's doing, how much a barrel of oil costs, or what the US federal rate of interest is. But particularly in times of economic uncertainty, such as those we're currently experiencing, keeping an eye on what's going on in Wall Street can actually really help to explain lots of the other things that are going on elsewhere in the economy. Morning Brew not only makes that information easily accessible to me by sending it straight to my inbox, but also takes the time to explain what some of those numbers and other stats mean. So if you want to join me in starting your mornings off informed, then you can sign up to Morning Brew for absolutely free at morningbrewdaily.com/Tom Nicholas. That link again is morningbrewdaily.com/Tom Nicholas. Thank you so much once again to Morning Brew for sponsoring this video, which we will return to right now. Okay, so back to Lizzie Maggie. Lizzie Maggie received a copy of Progress and Poverty as a gift from her dad not long after its publication. Gee, thanks Dad, a 400-page economics textbook. And in one way or another, Lizzie would dedicate the rest of her life to the single tax movement. She was the secretary of her local branch of the Women's Single Tax Club, she spoke at conferences, she taught evening classes in Georgist economics. The biggest testament to Maggie's enthusiasm and intellect, however, was the manner in which she distilled the many complexities of Henry George's theories into a simple to understand, fun to play board game called The Landlords Game. This was a pretty ingenious move on Maggie's part. See, the turn of the 20th century saw a boom in sales of commercial board games among the American middle class. On the one hand, new printing technologies were making such games easier to manufacture and cheaper to buy. On the other, the adoption of electric lighting essentially extended people's available leisure time. People were clamouring for new games to play, so why not use the opportunity to teach them about how landlords suck? In 1902, Lizzie Maggie wrote this letter to the Single Tax Review, the newsletter of her beloved movement. She outlines the basic concept for the Landlords Game, which would, she declared, provide a practical demonstration of the present system of land grabbing with all its usual outcomes and consequences. A year later, she patented her invention, including in her application an illustration of this game board, which no doubt looks pretty familiar. The board for the Landlords Game includes plots of lands to buy, water and electricity squares, tax and luxury squares, a neutral public park corner, a jail corner, a go-to-jail corner, and a final corner square which one receives $100 in wages for passing. The Landlords Game wasn't exactly the same as modern-day Monopoly. Anyone who's played a multi-hour game of the latter will be relieved to know that Maggie's creation had a set length of 5 circuits, after which the wealthiest player won. Further, it contained references to an unseen land-owning villain called Lord Blueblood, who, to add to his crimes, was also British, as well as squares for absolute necessities such as bread and shelter. In doing so, it pretty forcefully raises questions among players about landlordism and inequality. Nevertheless, given the tale of treachery and fraud which is to follow, it's worth noting how much this line drawing from 1903 does share with Hasbro's contemporary titan. See, Lizzie Maggie may have had her critiques of capitalism, but that didn't stop her from self-publishing a commercial version of the Landlords Game with help from some fellow Henry George fans in 1906. And presumably it sold some copies, but it certainly wasn't a runaway success. Maggie continued to tinker and refine the game, but she remained reliant on her work as a typist and later journalist to pay the bills. So, are the similarities between this game and this game pure coincidence? Well, no. Obviously not. Could you imagine? But the road from one to the other was full of twists and turns. Lizzie Maggie's commercial version of the Landlords Game may have been a bit of a dud. I imagine it was a bit like anyone who's ever been in a band that put out an album where she just had a room full of unsold copies of this thing. But remember, she didn't create it in order to get rich and famous. The game's primary purpose was to be a teaching tool. The game was designed so that each time a player landed on a square owned by another and was forced to pay them rent, it would spark a conversation about the morality of an economic system in which lazy landlords get rich off the back of the working class. Support for the single tax movement had already started to wane after Henry George's death in 1897. The likelihood that the United States might replace all taxes with a land value tax got slimmer and slimmer. Nevertheless, Maggie and others kept the faith. Unfazed by its commercial failure, Maggie continued to teach the Landlords Game to her comrades, and it quickly became a significant part of single taxer subculture. In fact, plenty of Georgists began to play it just for fun. One such group was the residents of the village of Arden in Delaware. Arden was established in 1900 as a model community in which Henry George's principles could be put into practice. To this day, all land within Arden is municipally owned and leased to residents, meaning that the benefits of any increase in the value of land within the village are retained for the community as a whole. It's unclear whether or not Lizzie Maggie actually visited Arden herself. Whoever first introduced it to the village, however, the Landlords game swiftly became a staple feature of Arden life. What's notable here is that the copies of the game being played in Arden were not the slick, commercially produced sets that Maggie had published in 1906. Instead, players made their own sets, featuring cloth boards and handmade cards. One outcome of this was that as the game spread through the community and new residents made new sets, they were able to iterate on the game's rules. For instance, players added some additional character to their boards by naming the different plots of land. Cheaper plots were given spoof names like Rubeville and Rickety Row, with more expensive plots being named after well-known wealth centres such as Fifth Avenue and Wall Street. Players in Arden also started to group the plots of land into sets of 2 and 3. The flip side of the game spreading from player to player in this way was that with each new link in that chain, the connection to Lizzie Maggie became weaker. Players increasingly thought of the Landlords game as a kind of folk game, like chess, without an inventor as such at all. Many didn't even call it the Landlords game. Some called it the Anti-Landlord game, others business, and others still the Monopoly game, or simply Monopoly. Had she known at the time how far her game was spreading, Lizzie Maggie perhaps wouldn't have minded not getting credit for inventing it. By the 1920s, the Monopoly game was being played across the northeastern United States. It was particularly popular in universities, where professors at institutions including Columbia and the Wharton School of Finance used it to enthuse students about concepts such as monopolies, market power, and antitrust laws. Maggie might even have appreciated some of the further additions that players were making to the game. Students at Williams College in Massachusetts, for example, added rules by which one could purchase little wooden houses to increase the rent that was due should another player land on one of your properties. Maggie might have been disappointed that these play sessions didn't necessarily end with an endorsement of a land value tax or her boy Henry George. Nevertheless, the game was still inviting discussions about how much landlords suck, so, halfway there. If this is where our story ended, then this might be a pretty drama-free tale. In fact, there's a real purity and wonder to the notion of this game being passed from person to person entirely through word of mouth. Had Lizzie Maggie's commercial version of the Landlords game been a success, then that version of the game would have been final. But its failure opened the door for the game to experience a kind of analog open source development process, with each new set of players making their own tweaks and refinements. It almost makes one question our current regime of stringent intellectual property laws, which give the originator of an idea a, monopoly on it. Unfortunately, after 3 decades of glorious experiment in collective board game design, someone had to come along and ruin it all. So, by the 1930s, the Monopoly game was being played far and wide. But in order to tell the story of how it got stolen, we only need to travel around an hour's drive from Arden to the coast. This is Atlantic City. Atlantic City had begun to be developed as a resort town in the 1850s. And by the early 1900s, it was a booming holiday destination. Atlantic City had a reputation as a city of vice. Its key industries were gambling, prostitution, and, during the Prohibition, booze. What might surprise you then is that many of its grandest hotels were run by Quakers. Now, I don't know how much people know about Quakers outside of them being the porridge people, but you know the Jesus was a socialist meme? Well, the Quakers, or Society of Friends as they're officially called, have more or less turned that into a whole denomination. Quakers are committed pacifists and, in theory at least, try to live their faith through fighting injustice and inequality. In fact, if you go to a meeting of any vaguely left-wing political group in the UK, there's a 50-50 chance it will take place in a Quaker meeting house. It was likely this animosity towards social injustice that led the Quakers of Atlantic City to become so hooked by the Monopoly game. The game reportedly made its way to Atlantic City from Arden via Indianapolis, which is quite the round trip. During this journey, the game had continued to evolve. The starting corner on Lizzie Maggie's board had referenced Henry George's belief that economic value is a product of natural resources plus human labour. Now, it just read go. The Quakers of Atlantic City would add their own amendments. A corner square which had once been a public park became free parking, which feels like the opening of a Not Just Bikes video. Just like countless players before them, they also renamed the property spaces on the board after the city in which they lived. Little did they know that those streets, from Mediterranean Avenue in brown through to Boardwalk in blue, would soon become the de facto property names for the Monopoly game across the United States. And that's all because of this slippery little snake, Charles Darrow. Charles Darrow was a salesman who lived in Philadelphia. In the late summer of 1932, Charles was invited round for dinner at a friend's house. His friends, Charles and Olive Todd, had just returned from visiting family in Atlantic City, where they'd been taught how to play the Monopoly game. The Todds, in turn, taught Charles. And little did they know, but that lesson would change everything. See, Darrow wasn't a particularly successful salesman. The Great Depression wasn't, as its name might suggest, a great time for most people, which made it harder and harder to sell them stuff. Further, Darrow had an ill son who needed expensive medical care. To offer him a little bit of sympathy, things for the Darrows were about as rough as they can get for anyone. In the Monopoly game, however, Darrow saw a way out. He enlisted the help of a friend, a political cartoonist called F.O. Alexander. Together, Darrow and Alexander would play game after game of Monopoly, with Alexander periodically adding distinctive illustrations and lettering to their shared board. The go arrow, the free parking car, the train symbol. All of these features of modern-day Monopoly are derivatives of Alexander's sketches from 1933. Once he was satisfied with these designs, Darrow had 500 copies of the game commercially printed and set about trying to sell them. Which, it's interesting how these stories about down-on-their-luck businessmen who started from nothing always involve them having enough money lying around to, start the business. It's worth emphasising that the only aspect which distinguished Darrow's version of Monopoly from the countless handmade versions being played in homes across the northeastern United States were the design elements, a contribution for which F.O. Alexander would never receive a single penny. The only personal innovation of Darrow's had been to experiment with making the Monopoly board circular, but that got scrapped by the time he actually released the game, so... After a short time hawking the game himself, Darrow got the letter that he had been hoping for. The wife of Parker Brothers president Robert Barton had seen the game being sold in FAO Schwartz and suggested to her husband that Parker Brothers might acquire it. Barton agreed. And in March 1935, Parker Brothers signed an agreement with Charles Darrow to purchase the rights to Monopoly. A shrewd businessman, however, Robert Barton knew that it wouldn't be enough to sell a slightly shinier version of an otherwise semi-popular folk game. He needed to crush any and all competition and claim Monopoly as his own. Now, Charles Darrow wasn't the first person to produce a commercial version of Monopoly. Obviously, there was Lizzie Maggie's Landlords game, which he produced a second, modified version of in 1924. But in the mid-1930s, one could also find finance, easy money and inflation on the shelves too. What made Darrow and Parker Brothers' effort different was the lengths that they went to in order to crush their competition and establish their version of Monopoly as the only one of its kind. Parker Brothers had a history of being pretty ruthless when it came to intellectual property. In the 1890s, the company had tried to claim ownership over Tiddlywinks. That's right, they wanted exclusive rights over the concept of flipping little discs into a cup. A decade later, they trademarked the words ping pong and fought to establish their own proprietary version of the sport as the only legitimate version of table tennis. Both episodes ended in disappointment for the company. With this in mind, Parker Brothers encouraged Darrow to compose an elaborate creation myth for Monopoly. The story he came up with placed himself as the game's sole inventor, without reference even to his mate F.O. Alexander. Darrow wrote that, "Being unemployed at the time, and badly needing anything to occupy my time, I made by hand a very crude game, for the sole purpose of amusing myself." Then, with help from Parker Brothers, he applied for a patent for the game. By rights, Darrow and Parker Brothers' patent application should have been thrown out on sight. As I discussed in my video about vaccine patents, an invention is only patentable if it is completely original. Darrow's version of Monopoly clearly infringed upon two separate patents awarded to Lizzie Maggie. And even if Maggie hadn't applied for those patents, the game was being played far and wide. By the same metric, neither Darrow nor Parker should have been able to trademark the word Monopoly, as enthusiasts have been referring to their own handmade versions of the game as Monopoly for decades. Nevertheless, for whatever reason, both patent and trademark were awarded. Over the coming years, Parker Brothers used this patent to remove all other Monopoly-style games from the market. They furthered their cause by making Charles Darrow's made-up invention story central to the game's marketing. The Great Depression was still in full swing, after all, and the story of a down-on-his-luck salesman who invented himself out of poverty was no doubt an inspiring one to many. There was just one more stop to make. In 1935, George Parker, the founder of Parker Brothers, travelled to Arlington, Virginia, where Lizzie Maggie now lived with her husband Albert. When Parker told Maggie that he wanted to purchase the patent to Monopoly, she must have been over the moon. In reality, Parker wanted to ensure that she wouldn't be able to challenge his company's ownership of the game. Maggie, however, wondered whether this meeting might be the first step in using it to revitalise interest in Henry George and the land value tax. Lizzie Maggie sold the patent to the Landlords game to Parker Brothers for a flat $500. And with that, Parker Brothers had established a monopoly on Monopoly. The Parker Brothers version of the game went on sale late in 1935 and was an instant hit. For while Monopoly-style games had been a widespread phenomenon prior to 1935, the player base had still been relatively niche. Much like the Georgist economic principles which had inspired the game, Monopoly likely seemed a little too nerdy for most players. The Parker Brothers marketing machine, however, reframed the game as aspirational. Landlords were no longer the villains of the game. In fact, bankrupting your friends and family was a virtuous thing to do. With this reframing, Monopoly quickly captured the American imagination. In its first year on the market, the game sold 250,000 copies. The next year, it sold 1,751,000. Monopoly brought in millions of dollars in pure profit for Parker Brothers in that year alone, and that's in 1935 money. Through wars, political crises, economic booms, and market busts, Monopoly sales have remained strong ever since. Under Parker Brothers' stewardship, the game quickly spread across the globe. The company first licensed the game to a manufacturer in the UK, but further international editions soon followed in France, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and pretty much everywhere else. With rare exceptions, each new edition of the game replaced the Atlantic City streets of the US version with those of a city within that country. The production of non-city themed versions of Monopoly is a much more recent phenomenon. In 1991, Parker Brothers was acquired by Hasbro. Or more precisely, Parker Kenner, which was an amalgamation of Parker Brothers and Kenner Toys, both of which had previously been gobbled up by General Mills, was floated onto the New York Stock Exchange, purchased and taken private by Tonka, which then itself went bankrupt and was bought out by Hasbro. But the long and the short of it is that Hasbro now owned Monopoly. One of their very first acts was to exploit the continued popularity of their most famous product by arranging tie-ins with other brands and bands and celebrities and films and basically anyone that would have them. Boston Red Sox Monopoly? Yup. Frozen 2 Monopoly? You got it. Warhammer 40,000 Monopoly? I mean, it's just such a natural collaboration. The website Board Game Geek lists a total of 1,400 variants, but I've seen estimates as high as 7,000. In fact, in writing this video, I became briefly obsessed with trying to discover the weirdest Monopoly tie-ins. And among all of the Primark Monopolies and DPD Monopolies, the very worst I discovered was this. Monopoly Unite Students Edition. International viewers probably haven't heard of Unite Students, but they are, to quote the Times, Britain's biggest student landlord. That's right, you can sit in your student flat, the cost of renting which is about to go up by 5%, and roleplay as your own landlord. Or, as the back of the box puts it, invest in flats and blocks, then watch the rent come pouring in. Just please don't think too hard about where that rent comes from. If there is an afterlife, then Lizzie Maggie must be looking down or up or sideways in abject horror. The game she designed to educate people about how land ownership drives inequality transformed into a novelty, which encourages tenants to venerate their landlords. But is it really that simple? Or is there something we can salvage from the wreckage? Looking at the cultural positioning of Monopoly in the present day, it's easy to feel a sense of loss. And in many ways, this story is a tragedy. Slimmed down to its most basic elements, it's the story of an enigmatic and inventive woman whose creation was stolen from her. Worse still, the bastardized version of Lizzie Maggie's Landlords game that we know today is often viewed as a celebratory symbol of exactly the social injustices and inequalities which she hoped that it would invite people to critique. Modern Monopoly is even structured in such a way that makes Henry George's land value tax seem pretty stupid. See, as I explained earlier in the video, a land value tax is calculated based only on the value of a bare piece of land itself, without taking into account any buildings that have been built on top of it. But in Monopoly, the value of empty lots of land is peanuts. Say you land on Illinois Avenue. That's Trafalgar Square if you're playing the UK version, or Ian Wright if you're playing this 2002 Arsenal edition, which I'm sure many of you are. If the owner of that square has built no houses, then you only owe them $20 in rent. But if you land on the same square and the player has built 3 houses on it, or coffee mugs if you're playing the Friends edition, then the rent will be a whopping $750. This suggests that the economic value of your stay in Illinois Avenue comes almost entirely from the houses rather than the land on which they're built. Of course, you could still be an absolute nerd and introduce a 100% land value tax to your game of Monopoly. But this would only result in the owner of Illinois Avenue, or Trafalgar Square, or Ian Wright having to hand $20 of your rent over to the bank. The remaining $730 would still be theirs to do with as they please. And that's probably not going to make a huge dent in the in-game wealth gap. That being said, I don't think all is lost. Because yes, a lot has changed with regard to Monopoly since Lizzie Maggie first wrote that letter to the Single Tax Review in 1902. But the core mechanic is still the same. Those who are lucky enough to gobble up all the land still end up with huge power over the landless. And as players circle the board, the rich still get richer and the poor still get poorer. The contradiction of Monopoly, in which despite everyone owning at least one copy, everyone also kinda hates it, is not just a result of poor sportsmanship. It's the result of thoughtful, inventive game design. Lizzie Maggie's critique of landlordism wasn't just present in the surface level features of her game, it was baked into its actual mechanics. Which means that despite all attempts to rebrand Monopoly as a celebration of contemporary capitalism, actually playing it leaves most people fizzing with rage. So maybe you will find yourself playing a game of Monopoly over the coming weeks. And maybe you will find yourself losing. And maybe you will find yourself limbering up in preparation to throw that board to the other side of the goddamn room. I hate this game. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. But if you do, try to console yourself with the knowledge that whilst you may be losing, you're also learning. And isn't that the real victory? Yeah, no, I still really hate losing. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it has been worthy of your time. If you know anyone else who you think also might enjoy or get something out of this intriguing tale of betrayal and also maybe some hope, then please do consider sharing it with them in whatever manner you think is best to do so. Thank you as ever to the people that make this possible, my very top Patreon supporters, Richard, Alan Gann, Luke Meyer, Gary, Dick on Spain, Bill Mitchell, Al Zweigart, ZC Reese, Alexander Blank, Neil Zabildgaard, Sophia R, Sergio Suarez, Nicholas Jacquemart, Strange Weekend, Ricardo Fernandez de Cordoba, Richard Rapoon, Elliot Day, Amit Singh Parahar, Parker Mead, Karen Rosenow, Gabriel Koch, Demelza, Jimmy Dunn, Christopher Cowan and TK Loving for being signed up to that top tier of Patreon. If you would like to join them in getting early access to my videos, copies of the scripts to them, access to like director's commentaries where I talk about the process of making each video and more, then you can find out how to do so at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Yeah, thank you so much for watching. Once again, have a fantastic holiday period and I will see you in my next video.